Hello, welcome to Model Kit Stuff and welcome to Airbrushing for Complete Beginners Part 5. And in this video we're going to do some actual painting, believe it or not. Yes, we finally got there. But I'm going to kick off by talking a little bit about setup, because the whole point of these videos is that I want to get everybody dropping all their excuses and using their airbrush, getting an airbrush if they've never used one before, or indeed using their airbrush more, because we're all guilty or have been guilty of coming up with all sorts of excuses to use the paintbrush rather than the airbrush. It takes too long to clean, it takes too long to set up, it takes longer to paint with an airbrush than it does with a brush because inevitably something goes wrong. All of this stuff, all of these myths, all of these things that people feel they experience, we are doing away with during the course of this series. And one of the things is setup time. So it's really interesting when I look at my modeling space and my desk. I have it set up for brush painting and not really for airbrushing. And I think probably many people are the same. So I have paintbrushes ready to go in arm's reach of where I'm sat. My paints aren't in arm reach. I've got to get up and get my paints off out of the drawers that I have in the unit, but you know, they're one step away, literally. But that's the same if I was airbrushing or brush painting. It's the same paints. So what I'm trying to say is a lot of people are probably in the position that I'm in, where the stuff for the airbrush is not actually on the desk. It's not readily available. And so you can be, it's a bit of an effort to start airbrushing. So there is a solution to that. And in my case, the solution is these two little pull-out drawers. So in my modeling desk unit, I have drawers which have all of my modeling tools in, all of my consumables, my paints, thinners, adhesives. I've got my some of my power tools in there. So everything is sort of one step away. But even though that's the case, I have a number of things that I need for airbrushing. So when I come to do airbrushing, I do actually have to set up. Whereas if I come to paint with a paintbrush, I can reach for the paintbrush. I can reach the drawer that's got the palettes in, and then I can reach the drawer that's got the paint in without really having to get up. But that's not the case for airbrushing. So when airbrushing, there's a number of things that I need. I need to put down some form of protection on the table. So I use a tea towel. And then on that tea towel, I will have my paint spray cup, which acts as a rest for the paintbrush when it's in airbrush when it's in use. I have my brush cleaner, airbrush cleaner. I have my lubrication. I have my paintbrush that I use for mixing paint and putting the paint from the palette, transferring it into the paint cup. It's a long bristled brush, so it'll reach right down to the needle at the bottom of the paint cup if I need it to. Been using this brush for years. I've got my oh no, it all dried on the inside of my nozzle paint cleaning device. I've got that as well, and all my little cleaning brushes of various types, all in a little pot there. So I've got all of those in one tray, and in this other tray I have my respirator, and then I have a big pile of latex gloves, which I use if I'm holding something and painting. It's the only time I really use them. I don't particularly like the gloves, to be honest, but sometimes there's a need. So by having all of this in a couple of trays, I can literally stand up, reach the trays, pull them out, put them on my desk and set up in no time. So I don't have that mental excuse of it takes too long to set up. Yeah, it does take a little bit longer to set up than brush painting. But Not that much really. My compressor is under my desk, and as you saw in a previous video, my 4 most common airbrushes are permanently set up ready to go. So I can be airbrushing in a matter of a few minutes. You know, it's not a big drawn out process with all of these things in different places that I've got to go and grab and pull together and then go and put back into places. So this goes on my little side table while I'm airbrushing these 2 drawers, and then I can pile everything back in when I've finished with it. So it's quick to tidy up, it's quick to set up, and it gets rid of one of those excuses as to why we don't airbrush as much as we could do. Because I was definitely guilty of going, oh, I'll just use my brush. Now I still like to use my brush. There's something therapeutic about brush painting, and you've seen on my videos many times I go, well, you know what, I could use the airbrush, but I'm going to use the paintbrush. You know, that is personal choice. What I'm doing here is getting rid of the excuse not to. And I actually believe that airbrushing is quicker than brush painting, if you're honest. And before this series is done, we will prove that to you. Anyway, there you go. This is my little tip. Get everything together, get it in a drawer, on a tray, in a big plastic tub, whatever it is, so that you can grab it and get your gear on your desk as quickly as you can, because not everyone's got the space to permanently set up a paint booth and have everything to hand. Obviously, if you have, that's even easier. You're just walking over to your paint area and you're ready to go. But most people, I suspect, are in a position like me where they're utilising a space and they've perhaps got limited space and they can't be permanently set up. So that's my advice. Everything that you use regularly, have it to hand in a little tray or plastic box or whatever it is, so that you can grab it and just get on with it. Right then, let's have some fun and teach you the very first steps in using an airbrush for painting. So just as a reminder, we have done buying your equipment and selecting your equipment and so on. We have done stripping down, rebuilding, getting to grips, getting to know your airbrush. We've done setting up and cleaning your airbrush. So we're not going to deal with cleaning today. We won't be talking about it, because then we also did priming, and in priming we talked about cleaning airbrushes as well. So in this episode we'll be doing very basic beginners entry-level airbrush stuff. So we'll be doing some painting and masking and sort of very basic elementary stuff, and then we're going to be doing a little bit of different masking techniques. We're going to break painting down into several videos so that you're not trying to take in too much at one time. So we're going to deal with basics, then we'll deal with what people commonly call the dots and dashes. So getting some finesse into your ability to put paint down and control it and put thin lines down and make camouflage patterns and all that sort of stuff. A lot of people start doing that right from the beginning, and I don't think that's actually the right way. That when you want to start to learn a bit more control with your airbrush, that's when you need to be doing them. So we won't be doing that in this episode. We'll be doing it in the next one. What I want you to understand is most people, when they start airbrushing, they because of a lack of experience, lack of confidence, they're putting paint down on large areas and then reverting back to a paintbrush to do detail, maybe the camouflage or whatever. We're going to get to detail painting a little bit later on. So we're going to be putting some paint on this, and we're going to be doing large areas. So I'm going to show you how to do some masking so that you can put paint down, and basically in a similar way to how we painted the primer on, we're going to paint the whole thing at once and sort of show you how that's done. But we'll do it in little sections. So, okay, that's what we're going to do today. So if you want to understand how to put paint down, we'll touch about thinning, we'll touch on air pressures and all that sort of good stuff during the course of it, then you need to keep watching. Right then, time to get painting. We're going to use this. This is Humbrol Acrylic 102, and Humbrol acrylics get bad press for, well, partly they bring it on themselves, and partly it's not really justified in my opinion. But we're going to use this to show you can chuck it through an airbrush, no problem at all. The colour we're using is 102, which the official name of is Army Green. I believe. I don't think they have the name on these pots anymore. They used to. But yeah, Army Green, just because it's going to stand out fairly well for you guys to see. And it's colour I don't use very often. In fact, I've just taken the plastic off this. So this pot has never been used before. I've probably had it a little while. And that is where I want to start with, the paint. So your paint, it needs a good stir before you do anything. Now, a lot of people shake paints, and I'm not really a fan of shaking paints. Depends on your paint system. If it's in a dropper bottle, then absolutely, you know, they're designed for that, and you can take the top off and stir them, obviously. But if they're a paint with a top or a lid, then really what you want to be doing is stirring it, because if you shake it, you're getting it all over the lid, and then you take the lid off, it runs all over the lid, and then it's running into it, and it just makes a mess, and it can actually stop the lids going back on properly, and you're just creating work for yourself. So stir it. There is different options for stirring. I used to use a cocktail stick, a toothpick, when I was younger. You can get these. I think these are the Tamiya ones, but there's a number of cheaper versions around, exactly the same thing. So it has a little spoon on the end, and also a paddle. So you can use both ends of it for stirring your paint. Nothing wrong with doing that. It's just going to take a little bit longer than if you've got something with a little bit of oomph behind it. So that's how I prefer it. I use this for acrylics, and I'm also anything. So first thing is stir your paint. Why? Because you want to have your pigment evenly distributed, so that your paint is at the consistency that was intended by the manufacturer before you start to thin it. Because if you don't mix it properly, and you've still got a lot of all your pigment at the bottom and a bit of pigment in a lot of carrier at the top, then when you come to thin it, you're going to have an even more translucent paint. So we want the paint to perform properly. So we start by giving it a stir and breaking up all that thick gloopy stuff at the bottom, and look at that. And then when we're confident that we've started to incorporate it a bit, then we can put the big guns on. So you can see how gloopy that is. This is going to be quite a thick paint. You see what it's doing to the motor? The motor's really struggling because it's that thick. Right, I'm going to mix the paint and then I'll come back to you. Right then, thinning our paint. I like to thin paint that's going through the airbrush using a combination of thinner and airbrush flow improver. This Vallejo one I find pretty much works for all acrylics. And then I'm using the Humbrol thinner that's designed for the system. Now, if you've been brush painting for years and you know you've got a thinner that works really well on your acrylic paints, by all means use that. All you're doing is thinning the paint. It's the same process as for brush painting. We just generally do it a little thinner for the airbrush. The reason why I always put a bit of flow improver in is the same reason that we did it with the primer. it just helps slow down the drying time of the paint. I mean, my paint's already starting to dry on my brush here. So it's really, really important that we're moving quickly, and what we've got, we have drying as slow as possible. So if it's really warm and you're painting, you probably want to put more in than if it's, you know, midwinter and cold and your drying time's slower anyway. So you can adjust this to suit your needs, and it's just experience and playing around with it. But I would say 25% flow improver is a good starting point, and then 75% thinner, which was the same ratio we used on primer, so that's easy for you to remember. Now you might want to mess around with that, like I say, that's experience, but right now if we sort of stay at those ratios, you won't be far wrong, and it will help reduce tip dry, and it may well make cleaning easier as well. So I'm not going to do ratios here, I'm not going to count drops, I'm just going to put some in because I've got a lot of thinning to do. This paint is really thick and gloopy, which is great because it means it's going to go a long way. So just start by giving that a good mix in. So don't get het up on scientific formulations for ratios of paints for different paint systems. It's not really needed. What you're trying to do is get your paint thin. That's all there is to it. You don't need to know a ratio and whether you should, you know, stand on your head and close one eye while you're doing it. It's just mix your paint and thin it. And I use, my general rule of thumb is speed. So how quickly the paint moves. So I've done quite a bit here, but you can see if I, well, firstly, if you pick the brush up, it should drop nice and cleanly without, if it leaves a bit of a strand, it's way too thick. But when I wipe it on the side of the palette, it should rush down quickly, which this does. This is still on the thicker side. Yeah, this will go through the airbrush, no problem at all. But it's still on the thicker side, so I'm actually going to put even more thinner in. And if you remember, this was my rule when you're starting out. When you think you've thinned your paint, thin it again. Yeah, thin. What we're going to do with the airbrush is we're going to do exactly what you do with a paintbrush. We're going to put thin layers up and build it up until we have the colour saturation we're looking for. So we're not expecting to put this down and it be covered all in one go. In fact, if you do that, you're doing it wrong. You're putting the paint on too thick, and that can lead to all sorts of issues, such as losing definition of the detail and so on. So I think that's thin enough to go through now. So we're going to put that into the airbrush. So just decant that in. So the airbrush we're using today is the Mobius 0.3. The reason is that this is the airbrush that has my 0.3 needle in, and I always think that the 0.3 needle is a good starting point. We said this earlier on in a video, that if you're just getting one airbrush, make sure you've got a 0.3 needle, because it sort of covers all the bases, and then you can develop your skills and your collection of needles and airbrushes to suit you. So we're using this, the Mobius. It's a really easy brush to use, really easy brush to clean. I really enjoy using it actually. It's a very comfortable brush as it happens as well. We set it all up like we discussed in a previous video, so this is ready to go. Now, one of the things that I do is I remove the air cap. Now, just to comment on this, the air cap, the shape of your air cap, will dictate how your paint performs as it's leaving the airbrush. As the air is coming out and your atomized paint, the shape of this can change how that atomization falls and lands on your model. So different airbrushes have different shapes, and different companies will sell different ones. So there we've got one that's got a side cutout, and then I've got another one, if I can reach it, that's got holes in, and it helps with fine atomization. So it's up to you if you want to take it or not, off or not. I find taking it off helps me get in and pinch out any tip dry, which you can get from time to time. So I like to take it off. That's my personal preference, but of course be very careful with the needle. So what I like to do is get a little bit of cardboard or scrap paper or something, just check that the airbrush is flowing properly before we put it on the model. What we don't want is a load of spatter or too thin paint or too thick paint landed on your model. So check your airbrush is working on a disposable piece of card or something first. So how we do this is, first of all, we put air on, so we press the trigger down, and then we pull back for paint, and we've got paint flowing through. And then to switch it off, we turn the paint off by pushing forward and then lift to take the air off. Now that last bit is really important. If you just take your finger off and let the trigger flick back, what it does is it causes spatter, it causes a build-up of paint on your needle. And then when you come to put your paint back on and you press the trigger, you'll get spatter. You'll get 2 or 3, maybe up to half a dozen little lumps of paint spit out, and we don't want to cause any spitting. So it's really important that you practice paint off, air off. It's really important. So at a most basic level, putting paint down is exactly the same process that we did with priming, and we're going to paint in exactly the same way. We're going to start off the model, we're going to go across, and we're going to finish off, and we're going to do it in the same way with layers that overlap, and we're going to build that color saturation up slowly. So what we want is thin layers, build it up. So air on, paint on, okay, so that's what we're doing. So nice and thin, we're building up the saturation of the paint. Periodically, just stop and check your needle for any tip dry. I don't have it. And by the time you've gone over and done your area, you'll be able to go back and go over it again. So try not to go over it too many times to start with, otherwise your paint will start to pool and it'll get a bit liquid. I'm just going to bring you in a bit. So this isn't possibly for beginners, but I'm going to show you the technique anyway. If you just switch air on and go over the area you've painted, you can force dry your paint. And that can just speed up your painting time. So I'm just going to paint this tip, doing exactly that process. So that is most basic painting, block painting. Now, air pressure, when you're painting, you need to drop it a little bit. I reckon 20, but the range is somewhere between 15 and 25. So again, it's not an exact science. It depends on your paint, how well you've thinned your paint, so on and so forth. But what I'd say is, if you put it on around about 20, that's a good starting point. Remember, that's 20 when you press the trigger. Okay, so let's show you some basic masking so that you can put paint down and start doing some painting with your airbrush, because that's the most simple way of using your airbrush, is by masking everything you don't want to paint and then paint the whole thing in one colour, and then mask it and paint the whole thing in one colour. We will get to being able to paint details without all this masking and that sort of stuff, but right now that's your start point. You're going to put colour down in a blanket format, but we still need to build it up, we still need to thin our paint properly, we still need to understand what we're doing. So let's look at some basic masking. So actually one of the simplest forms of masking is masking with blue tack, and what that does, particularly on, it works particularly well on things like aircraft camouflage patterns, is it covers area but it sticks in place. It's quick to put on, quicker than using masking tape. It's cheap, it's reusable, and it's easy to shape. But what it does do is it gives you a soft edge. So what it's going to do is, because it's rounded and it's not crisp, the paint will sort of atomize, and some of it will go underneath and some of it won't, so you'll end up with a soft edge. So it's actually a really nice effect. If you want to do that and want a soft edge, then blue tack is definitely the way to go. So I'm gonna show you by putting a little sausage down. There you go. So what we're going to try and do is paint between those and do some simple, really quick and easy masking. So all we're doing is putting down a solid colour again, but this time we're letting the masking decide where the paint doesn't go. And you can see what we're doing is we're putting it down in thin layers and building it up. So we get the saturation gradually. We're not staying in one spot and building it up, because that'll make the finish uneven. There we go. So we can allow that to dry and then take the masking off, or we can just take the masking off. And that is painting and masking at its most basic form. And when I take this off, you'll see we've got this nice, if we can get the camera to focus, we've got this nice soft edge to it where the paint has got underneath but couldn't fully get underneath there. So we've got some paint falling, some gaps between the little drops of paint, and so that gives you that soft edge effect, which is really nice on aircraft, and you see lots of people using the blue tack technique. So that's a really simple way of putting your airbrushed paints down and controlling where it goes and where it doesn't go. So blue tack is always a good starter. Now if you want a more crisp solid edge, then you're looking at masking tape, and you know this yellow modeler's tape is great stuff. There is some drawbacks to it. Sometimes it doesn't stick as well as you'd like, so that can be a drawback. But the advantage to it is that you can cut it to shape, you can cover big areas and leave small areas uncovered, you can do individual panels. It's so flexible, and you have more control than you do with the blue tack. So what we're going to do is we're going to simulate painting a couple of areas and masking a bit of it off. So let's just say there's a bit underneath in there that we want to keep black. So just for the sakes of argument, we'll put a little bit of tape down. Like that. So paint can get underneath the masking tape. So you've got a couple of options here. Firstly, make sure you've pressed it down really, really well. If you can see air under it, then paint's going to get under it. Yeah, that's your first thing to think about. The second thing is you could seal it. You could put a clear coat over it, which means that any paint is going to sit on top of the clear coat, and when you remove it, you're going to get a crisper line. But as long as you're not really driving that paint hard, you shouldn't have a problem. Where you've got big panel lines and things like that, that's where the paint is at the risk of traveling. So you have to make a decision on whether you want to seal it or not. Now, when it comes to controlling your airbrush, there's not just the trigger that offers some control, there's also your hand. So your hand offers control as well, backwards and forwards. So the closer you get, the smaller the atomized cone of paint is when it makes contact with your model. So therefore, the narrower the line. So I'll give you an example. If we do this far away, we get a big spot. If we do it close up, we get a small spot. Yeah. So what you're doing is you're controlling your paint by getting the distance right and your trigger. So you start by gradually putting the trigger on and then pulling it back. You don't go all the way to the back. You very, very rarely need to pull it much further than just a little way. Yeah. So if you're having to pull it right back and to get your paint flow, your paint's probably too thick. So what we're going to do is we're just going to be a bit closer this time because we want to make sure we don't go over here. You can see we've only masked a small strip off. Air on, paint on, and this time I'm doing circles. We'll talk about that in a minute. So we can let that dry and give it a second coat in a moment. So the reason why I was doing circles, is because sometimes you want an uneven finish. You don't want to have it so that you've then got to do weathering on top. So if you want an uneven finish, circles means that you get the paint overlapping in a disorganized manner, and so you have thick spots and thin spots of paint, and it's a good way of putting age in and giving it a more natural look. Just going to force dry that a little bit. We can put some more in. So I can go a little bit further back actually. You can see how much control we've got. There's hardly any paint on that masking tape. So, you know, by just being confident with it, and I know I've got experience and what have you, what I'd say is if you're inexperienced, mask off the rest of it if you need to. But this is the basic technique. It's not too far back on your trigger, pull it back gradually to get the spread of paint you want, and use your hand to get the airbrush in and out to get close or not. Now if you get too close you can get spidering and all that sort of stuff, but this is all about practice and showing you the techniques. So do it on some cardboard and mess around and practice if you want, but this is basic painting. One colour, solid, and wherever isn't masked off, you're going to put the paint down, and it's very simple, you know. And how quick was that compared to using a paintbrush? So there you go. We take our masking tape off, and you can see we've got a crisper finish on that edge now. We've got detail that we've been able to cover up so that it doesn't get paint on, so we can shape that paint now. And we can do that in a way that you can't do with a paintbrush unless you mask. And you're much more likely to get paint going underneath the tape with a paintbrush than you are with an airbrush, because the atomized paint is just landing in the areas it can get to, whereas a paintbrush can drive and push paint into areas. So yeah, we've got nice crisp lines there. We've got nice soft lines. And for me, those are the two basic masking techniques when you're first using an airbrush. So masking off can take a little bit of time, but as you've seen with using blue tack, it doesn't have to be a big process. Now if we look at this wing here, the one that we painted earlier, you can see you've got some subtle undulations in the paint. So when that's fully dry, you could go over it again if you really wanted to, or you can weather it and make it part of the paint scheme. So that's it. That's basic painting. And when you start out, that's what you want to do. You want to be painting areas, blanket painting areas, and masking off what you're not using. Okay, and then what I want you to do is do a little bit of practice ahead of the next video with distances. So get your paint on, understand how distance affects what you're doing. Just have a play with it. Now, so before we start dealing with dots and dashes and how to control your airbrush with lots of finesse, what we're going to do is we're going to deal with common issues. So spatter, bubbling in the paint cup, paint not coming out, all of those sort of common issues. Going to take you through what's likely to be causing them, the process of resolving them. Then you're in a position to start really getting to grips with your airbrush, and we can do dots, lines and circles, and practice our airbrushing skills. So next time we'll do some issue resolving, but right now you now know how to prime and just get paint down on a model. And it's not difficult, and it's lots and lots of fun. So I'm not going to show you how to clean this out. It's the same process as cleaning a primer out. We just don't want the paint drying in the paint cup or in there. So just do it exactly as I've shown you in the last one. We'll perhaps cover cleaning up later again, just to sort of ram it home. But yeah, you now know everything you need to know to basically put paint on your model, but there's more to learn. I will see you in the next video. I hope that was useful. I've tried to not make it too heavy. Your key takeaways are: mask what you don't want paint to go onto, thin your paint properly, air on, paint off, air off. That's your most important tip. And don't forget to get all your stuff together so you're organised and not got an excuse not to set up and go. Until the next time, you enjoy your modelling, and I will see you very soon. Bye for now. Thanks for watching. Please hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't done so. It's free, and that way you won't miss my first impressions, my tool reviews, my product reviews, and any of my builds. including wooden model kits as well as plastic. It's all free, and if you'd like to support the channel, you can hit my PayPal link in the text below. Every pound goes straight into the channel to keep the cameras rolling and to do more fun stuff for you to watch.